Joining us now is the financial services leader for KPMG, Mitch Siegel. Mitch, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So you advise banks, essentially, on how to compete and stay relevant and stay up to speed in a world where all sorts of fintech startups are popping up, is that right?
Right, correct.
Okay, so what advice do you give them, and how do you know what advice is right for them, whether they should buy a startup, build internally on their own, or actually maybe do a strategic partnership with one of these fintech startups?
Right. So it all really boils down to some pretty basic premises around everybody's trying to grow, cut costs, and mitigate risks. And so as you start to look at your business from those very simple perspectives and identify gaps, you can sort of look at those gaps and say, okay, am I able to build the capability that I need to compete in whatever area that is, or do I need to go out and partner or potentially buy something?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what are some of the biggest banks that you're advising?
Really all the top tier banks. So we work with basically the top 20 or 30 banks and advise them on their strategies, from everything to competing from a growth perspective to how do they kind of optimize their customer experience and compete with the fintechs, the digital startups that are sort of coming into the fintech space so that the banks can emulate those types of experiences.
Why do you think, to me, the M&A in the fintech space has been surprisingly low, in my opinion?
Yeah.
It's been slow, and I've been in a position where I've done acquisitions before, and if I was running one of these banks, I would buy Acorn, Digit, Betterment.
Everyone, all of them.
No, Peter, don't give me a hard time just because you were right. I mean, you could pick up some of these companies for $50 to $100 million. Like,
sure.
What's the issue?
I think there's a lot going on, right? So the banks are encumbered with a lot of regulatory processes that they're still trying to unwind from, literally 6 or 7 years ago.
Yes.
And they're looking at their businesses holistically, and the gaps that they find, can they find a company that really fits the niche of that gap? And then they've got to integrate that into their business, which is really complicated. That integration.
Well, that's very well put, and that's something I was wondering. Do they look at something? Let's stay in the realm of hypothetical.
Sure.
Do they look at an Acorn or Betterment or something like that and say, oh my, regulation-wise, we're not even going to be able to use this?
Right.
Does that go on, you think?
It's another piece of it. So if you look at the fintechs, there's a lot of movement right now around potentially regulating the fintechs, but they've not been highly regulated. So in some cases, a bank may go out and purchase a fintech that doesn't really meet the needs of the regulatory environment that they have to, and so they've got to do so much massaging of that business to pull it in that it's almost not worth the purchase price. So then they look at partnership opportunities.
Okay, so you said some of the big money center banks are your clients. We know that these big banks have a lot of different business lines, whether it's research, whether it's trading, whether it's lending or wealth management, or they're private banks. Which of those sectors is being most disrupted by new financial technology?
Yeah, it's really across the board. So if you think about the way that we as consumers go about our daily lives and the unbundling of our lives, we're using apps for so many different things now. So really the retail banking is probably the real beachhead of what's being disrupted the most, and everything kind of follows behind that. So if you think of wealth management is an extension of retail. It's a very consumer-driven business. And then everything kind of falls behind that. Even insurance, right? You look at things like driverless cars and those types of things. Great disruption kind of across all of those different sectors within financial services.
Break it down for viewers. What are banks doing to appeal more toward millennials, who probably maybe prefer, given their lifestyle or what's been convenient for them up until this point, is a la carte options along the way?
Sure. Well, if you think about the average millennial, they're delaying life cycle events. So they're getting married later, they're purchasing cars later, they're buying houses later, and so that delays the bank's ability to offer you a product or service, if you're a millennial, that you could actually buy. So they're not necessarily looking at it as a millennial challenge. It's that millennials look at things differently, and it's actually starting to impact all demographics. As far as the unbundling that I spoke about later, and the heavy use of technology, and we all sort of expect the experiences that we have in our retail lives as we're in commerce and we're doing those types of things, and we expect our banks to bring us those same types of experiences.
Can you give us a number in terms of how much banks are spending on building out and buying up new technology?
I'm not sure I could, actually, because I think there's a number of different things that are going on in the background, and it's not that everybody's looking at potentially purchasing a fintech. There's a lot of partnership opportunities. There's a lot of banks that are going out and building those fintech-like consumer types of experiences because they actually think they can do it better in a highly regulated environment than the fintechs can.
I mean, I'll give you a statement and then you say agree, disagree, or right. I think the M&A has to heat up in the next 12 months. I think 2017, we have to, it seems so likely to me, despite the regulatory issues, that we're going to see a bunch of these standalones get taken out by large banks. Agree or disagree?
Agree.
Okay.
I think there'll be a lot more partnerships as well. It depends on how you define M&A, right?
Okay.
So a lot of partnerships forming where a bank is trying to fill a very narrow niche of a capability that they don't want to go out and have to create. And so they pull a fintech in to potentially have a partnership and share revenue.
And how does the fintech benefit from that?
Well, the banks still today have the actual customers, right? So fintechs generally have a very small sliver of the customer base. They've got great technology in many cases, not highly regulated yet, but the banks are still have the bulk of the customers.
Okay. All right, Mitch, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Let me just do a viewer comment before we go to our next thing. Andres Huerta says, the banking industry is definitely overregulated. The problem is we have seen the consequences of underregulation. A healthy balance must be struck so as not to overburden the industry with such costly compliance efforts. Very nice comment. Thank you, Andreas.